How's it going, everyone? I'm Town Cape, and today I'm going to give you my analysis on how the narrative and mechanics work together to convey the message of the Hotline Miami series. Hotline Miami has one of the most bizarre stories in gaming, and to this day, gamers still debate over what actually is going on. I'll be giving my opinions in regards to the series' overall design, its characters, and its plot. This review will contain spoilers from both Hotline Miami 1 and 2, so if you haven't finished either, then you may not want to watch this review. Hotline Miami is designed to be a parable for the late 80s, early 90s video gaming period, and it does this by actually being designed as a late 80s, early 90s video game. Just examine Hotline Miami, and then examine the state of gaming in the late 80s and early 90s. The music is obviously reminiscent of music of that age. The last time 2D pixelated graphics of this quality were used in such a mainstream game was during the late 80s, early 90s. Even some of the mechanics of Hotline Miami, such as respawning at the start of the level along with your enemies, was first introduced in an early 90s game. The whole idea of the game's story actually being a movie playing on a VHS tape is also a throwback to the early 90s game, because that's what early video game stories were trying to do. They were just trying to copy movies. I believe Dennaton Games would design Hotline Miami with this style so they could give the audience cues on what the story was about. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that a game which is designed like a late 80s, early 90s game has its story set in the late 80s, early 90s time period as well. The only aspects of Hotline Miami that really distinguish it from a late 80s, early 90s game is its bizarre story. However, I think the story is only bizarre if you look at it out of context. I think if we actually examine what's going on in gaming in the late 80s, early 90s, then the story and its message become a lot more clearer. Let's start by looking at the two main characters of Hotline Miami. I think Jacket is a representation of the typical young 80s gamer. Yes, I'm aware that there were adult gamers in the 80s, but the demographic was younger back then, and many gamers were children. That's really how I see Jacket. He's just an immature kid who does things without thinking them through. Sure, he looks like a fully grown man, but the way he just goes around mutely killing people is reminiscent of many protagonists in 80s shooting games that were controlled by kids. In many of these early games, you're only giving vague reasons as to why you're killing. That sense of vaguely justified killing is recreated in Hotline Miami thanks to the cryptic phone calls. On the other hand, the biker is the opposite. He represents the minority of 80s gamers who were older and wanted more from their games than just mindless killing. So he has a level of maturity that Jacket doesn't, and this maturity is expressed in the mechanics of the game as much as the story. For starters, Biker can't just kill anyone he doesn't like. He only kills if necessary. The gameplay with him also involves more thinking. Biker can't just pick up any weapon like Jacket and use it. He only has his standard weapons, so the player has to adapt to all kinds of enemy encounters using nothing more than Biker's standard cleaver and throwing knives. But that's not the only way that playing Biker involves more thinking than playing Jacket. The word puzzle also has to be solved during Biker's missions. If the player solves the word puzzle, then Biker gets information about the 50 blessings and what they're up to from the janitors. But if the player doesn't solve the word puzzle, then the janitors don't really tell him anything important. So the game encourages more brain work from the gamer when they're playing Biker. Anyway, now let's move on to the characters of Hotline Miami 2. A lot of fans have speculated that Martin Brown is a sociopath and that he's not really an actor. But I don't really agree with that. I think he is an actor, but he dislikes how public interest has shifted to violence and gore ever since Jacket's mafia murders. I mean, look at the names of the movies he's worked in previously. Blue Ocean, The Calm, Land of Trees. You can tell that these are obviously peaceful, family-friendly movies, so I think Martin Brown is actually a peaceful person. However, present-day Miami is only interested in violence, so now Martin Brown can no longer act in family-friendly roles in order to stay in business. He has to compromise his values and sign up for gory films. I think Martin Brown is used to symbolize the idea of controversy selling in the late 80s, early 90s video gaming industry. It was around that period that developers discovered that things like violence and nudity were controversial, so they helped to publicize games and boosted their sales. For example, Sega's uncensored version of Mortal Kombat outsold Nintendo's censored version on a scale of 4 to 1. However, not all game developers were actually interested in violent video games, so they ended up quitting the industry when their family-friendly titles didn't sell that well. Martin Brown is used to epitomize these developers. Sure, he has signed up for a gory film in order to stay in business, but he doesn't actually like being violent. That's why the director tells him to put some more passion into his attacks. That's why people accuse him of being a sellout. It's because he is a sellout. He denies it, and he tries to pretend he likes being violent, but that's not true. That's why I like how Dennaton designed Martin's Aubrey mask to not cramp in any special abilities. It's a good way of depicting his disinterest in violence. In fact, Dennaton is quite consistent with his design choice throughout the game. Richard and the Henchman, the only other two characters without any special abilities, are both characters who, like Martin Brown, aren't really interested in killing people, but are doing so out of compulsion. Anyway, it's Martin Brown's denial that ultimately leads to his death. He's killed on set when a prop gun ends up being a real one, so somebody replaced the prop gun with a real gun. But who did it? Well, Martin Brown himself did it. Remember, Richard told Martin Brown that he wouldn't like how the film ended. If we read the script lying in the apartment set, we discover that the girl isn't supposed to shoot Martin Brown, but is instead supposed to be assaulted by him again. So I think what Martin Brown did was replace the real script with a fake one. In this fake script, the girl is supposed to shoot him. This can explain why a script that differs from the events that concur is randomly lying in Martin's apartment set. Martin then replaced the prop gun with a real gun, so his suicide mission would be complete. It's plausible why Martin Brown would want to commit suicide in these circumstances. He no longer has any more hope for the industry that he once loved, so he decided to quit his job, and he decided to quit it quite literally. Speaking of peace-loving characters, now let's talk about Wright. Some fans think he's the only one who could actually be considered a hero, but I'm not sure about that because he does seem to have a bit of a dark side. This guy actually knows that Manny Pardo is the Miami mutilator. I mean, he tells Pardo about how he owes him and how Pardo would eventually be fired for incompetence and misconduct. It's obvious he's referring to how Pardo is the Miami mutilator. It's plausible that Even found out about Pardo's secret when he was investigating him as a journalist. However, Even doesn't turn him in, but instead turns to bribing him for favors. That's not what I would call a hero. In fact, as a journalist, Even is pretty extreme. I mean, he's not about breaking into casinos and contacting escaped criminals just so he can get the information he needs for his book. He's even willing to give big bucks away for information, despite his family being poor. I say that Even's extreme journalism techniques represent the state of game journalism in the late 80s and early 90s. I mean, back then, the gaming industry had just recovered from the crash. Becoming a game journalist then was really seen as a risky job. What's more telling of this is how Even's hallucinated wife tells him to go get a real job at one point in the game. Even today, game journalists get told all the time to go get a real job. The interesting thing about Even is that unlike the other non-violent characters in the game, he's actually given a special ability, Rage Mode. For the most part, Even plays non-lethally, but in Rage Mode, he can resort to lethal methods to dispose of enemies. However, the game doesn't encourage Rage Mode, as player obtains less points by resorting to it. However, I do think Rage Mode is a good way of representing the inner, darker side of Even, so I like that it was included in the game. I also like Manny Pardo. By now, everybody should know that Pardo is an attention-seeking psychopath, so instead of going on about that, I'll tell you what I believe he represents. I think the answer also lies in the idea of controversy giving publicity of the late 80s, early 90s. Companies like Sega wanted to use violence to promote their games, but they didn't want the violence to lead them to being sued in court by a bunch of angry parents. In other words, they wanted to promote the positive image brought about by violent video games, but not the negative image which could be used to stop them in their act. Doesn't that sound like what Pardo is doing? He wants to promote the positive image of the Miami mutilator that is brought about by gruesome murders and can make the Miami mutilator famous, but not the negative image which links him to the Miami mutilator and can get him locked up. So yeah, it seems that there are some pretty nasty characters in this series, but that doesn't mean there aren't any humble ones. Richter is a fairly humble character. His story of wanting to protect his mother seems to be a throwback to the early protection quests. Quests which involve protecting an NPC were and are almost always designed to be escort quests. However, escort quests are rarely ever done right. Most of the time they just make the player end up hating the NPC they're protecting. That's why I think it was a good move on Dennaton's part for Richter's mom to never appear outside of cutscenes. In fact, judging by how vulnerable all the characters are, escort quests just wouldn't work in Hotline Miami. So yeah, by restricting Richter's mom to cutscenes, Dennaton was able to make her likable and keep her from becoming annoying. The other humble characters in the game are the Henchman and Beard. They're both very similar. They're both well-trained people who have gotten tired of the rough life and want to retire. The primary difference is that Beard seems to be more mature and more knowledgeable about it. We see that the Henchman can't deal with losing his girlfriend, but we see Beard giving Jack advice about how to deal with a breakup. Beard knows how to deal with loss, while the Henchman doesn't. Overall, I don't really see how the dynamic between Beard and the Henchman really adds anything meaningful to the game. The only thing I can think of is that it's a throwback to the immature, mature gamer phenomena of the late 80s, early 90s. But that was already done much better than the original game, so I'm not exactly sure why Dennaton seemed to retread old ground here. A better executed dynamic would be the parallels between the fans and the Sun. Dennaton already confirmed that the fans represented the players who wanted the sequel to be just like the original game. Well, I believe that's also true of the Sun. While the fans symbolized the players who wanted to play a protagonist who was like Jacket and had Jacket's story, the Sun represents the people who wanted the villains to be just like the Russian Mafia and his cronies. However, Hotline Miami goes out to portray how hopeless it is to expect a sequel to be exactly like the original. That's what both the fans and the Sun wants, and look where that leads them. Like, they both see themselves as the sequels to the originals, but no matter how hard they try, they can't become what the originals were. But even putting the story aside, the mechanics alone can be used to distinguish how different the fans and the Sun are from their predecessors. The fans have abilities similar to Jacket, but they're not the same. Only Tony has a monster Jacket used in the first game. However, his one is nerfed because he can't use weapons with it. Similarly, the Sun's abilities for the most part are much more varied and complex than what his fathers and his cronies had. There are some throwbacks to his father's female bodyguard though. The sunglasses and the katana that the Sun wields when he uses the bodyguard technique may be the same ones that the female bodyguard had. But all his other techniques are different, and that really denotes how different of a person the Sun happens to be from his father. While the Sun's distinction from his father lies primarily in his techniques, the fans' distinction from Jacket lies primarily in their personality. Each of the fans' personality is quite different from Jacket, and quite different from each other as well. The only trait I would say that they all share is that they're all young and reckless. I'd also say that Dennaton didn't seem to do a very good job of meshing in the different personalities of each fan with how their story was told. This is a common mistake which pops up a lot in game design. When you have a diverse group of people going out on missions together, it becomes difficult to keep them all in character while also allowing for a well-designed gameplay experience. Let's take a look at how the fans' levels are designed. In the first scene, we see the fans discussing if they should go out on a shooting spree or not. Tony, Ash, and Mark seem like they're all for it. It's only Corey who expresses some uncertainty. That's Corey's personality right there. She's the silent, careful type. We see evidence of this in the later scenes as well. If she's not sure about something, then she probably won't do it. However, when the fans reach the target building, the only fans which are willing to participate are Tony and Corey. Now it makes sense why Tony would want to participate because he's the hot-headed, upfront type of guy, but it doesn't make sense why neither Ash nor Mark would want to participate. I mean, they seem to be all for it in the previous cutscene. The fact that Corey of all people would want to participate rather than Ash and Mark doesn't make any sense from a story perspective. But it does make sense from a gameplay perspective. A basic game design concept is to introduce the easy mechanics first and the more difficult ones later. Out of all the playable characters in the fans, the ones with the easiest mechanics are Tony and Corey. Sure, Tony can't pick up weapons, but other than that his playstyle is identical to what Jacket had when he wore the Tony mask in the previous game. Similarly, there's nothing really complex about how Corey plays. She's basically a shooter with a dodging ability that renders her invulnerable during the dodge. Temporary invulnerability-inducing moves can be helpful for new players who have trouble adjusting to the difficulty of the game, so it makes sense to have Corey as a starting character. In comparison, both Ash and Mark have more complex mechanics that aren't new player friendly. Ash is partnered with his sister Alex, and the player controls both, while the former leads the way. Alex is a melee weapon user, while Ash is a shooter. Controlling both of them and getting them to attack at the right angles can be difficult for new players, so it makes sense for why they're initially locked. The same case holds for Mark. There are many ways to play Mark depending on the circumstance. He can fire both horizontally and vertically. After he's out of ammo, he resorts to melee combat. This can be a bit too much for a new player to take in, so it makes sense why he's initially unplayable as well. However, none of this makes sense from a story perspective. From a story perspective, it would make sense for Ash and Mark to participate in the first scene, rather than Corey. From a story perspective, it would also make sense for Ash rather than Corey or Tony to go get his friend's sister. I mean, why is Ash not participating in a mission in which his friend's sister is to be retrieved? Isn't he supposed to be the one who knows what she looks like? With a character like the Sun, these problems don't arise. The Sun is one character with his own personality. He's not a collection of different personalities with different ideas and opinions. However, the Sun isn't without his own inconsistencies. He basically has the same abilities as Corey, Tony, and Mark, but the problem is that his latter two abilities are initially unlocked. The Tony-like lethal punches are unlocked after the Sun shoots up a Colombian strip club, while the Mark-like double shooting style is unlocked after the Sun robs a Colombian bag. Wait, what? How does a Colombian strip club give you access to a lethal punching style? How does a bag give you access to a double shooting style? The unlocking of the Sun's abilities makes no sense from a story perspective. It's true that the unlocking of the playable fans made no sense from a story perspective either, but hey, at least it made sense from a gameplay perspective. You can't say the same about the Sun, because his levels are the final levels in the game. You start playing the Sun after you finish playing each member of the fan. By then, you've already mastered all the abilities of the fans, and since the Sun's abilities are pretty much identical to the abilities of the fans, they should be immediately available to the player. It just doesn't make sense for the player to have to earn these abilities again. The ending of Hotline Miami 2 is crazy, but in a way, it's also quite poetic. Remember what happened in the end of Hotline Miami 1? Jacket defeated the Russian boss. What happens at the end of Hotline Miami 2? A Russian boss wannabe defeats a group of Jacket wannabes. So in a way, the Sun avenges his father. That's why it ends with him walking through some grandiose rainbow. The Sun believes he's achieved something his father couldn't. However, it still leads him to his death. Similarly, all the time the fans wanted to get a cryptic call from 50 Blessings and go on real murder missions. And they got that call. Or at least they believe they did. When the Sun calls Ash, Ash mistakenly believes it's a call by 50 Blessings, because the way the Sun talks during the call can be interpreted as a cryptic message. I mean, he tells Ash to go somewhere, and he gives him an address, just like how the typical cryptic 50 Blessing calls told you to go somewhere, and then they gave you an address. That's why Ash is so excited after receiving the call. However, his excitement just leads him and his friends to their doom. So the game makes it really clear that simply copying something else, whether it be a role model or another game, is just going to lead to failure. Anyway, now we're at the last character that deserves to be discussed, Richard. One of the biggest debates in the community is what exactly Richard is. Some people have proposed that Richard is a sign of madness or death. However, I think Richard embodies a concept that has been around in games since the 80s and exists till today. Doubt. There has always been a lot of doubt in the video game industry. This was especially the case in the late 80s, as the industry had just recovered from a massive crash. Questions like, can the video games really be a sustainable industry, were still flying around. But even questions like, can video games ever be art, were also there. Since the industry was still young, there was more doubt back then than there is today. Anyway, that's why I believe Richard has such an omnipresent feel about him. It's because a lot of characters doubt themselves at some point in the game. When this happened, Richard appears. But I'd like to add that I don't think Richard is physically there. Rather, I think he's just in the character's head due to a dream or hallucination. I like how he only appears in cutscenes. That renders the player unable to interact with him mechanically, and that makes sense because you can't physically interact with something that's in your head. Now let's take a look at how Richard appears to each character throughout the series. Martin Brown hallucinates Richard when he begins to doubt himself. The interviewer doesn't believe Brown when he claims he loves violence, and this causes Brown to doubt himself. Then Brown tries to deny his doubt by claiming the interview is a dream, but that's not the case. Similarly, Mark sees Richard when he begins to doubt that he'll ever be accepted in the fans. That's the thing about Mark. Compared to all the other fans, he feels kind of detached. He doesn't really contribute anything meaningful to the group. Tony is the leader, Corey is the situation analyzer, Ash and Alex have all the connections, But Mark just seems to be a tag-along, and just seems to nod his head to everything the majority says. I mean, compared to people like Ash who have demonstrated technical expertise, the only thing we've seen out of Mark is grabbing pizzas. He even talks about pizza a lot. He just seems like a tag-along, and I think Mark knows this, but he wants to be more accepted. That's why one night he has a fantasy about getting everyone their highly anticipated Richard Moss, but that sadly predicts a future without Mark and without his friends, rather than a future where Mark is truly accepted by his friends. Anyway, even sees Richard when he doubts that his book will be able to support his family. Richter sees Richard when his doubts of being truly safe begin to creep in. The son sees Richard when he doubts his father will be really proud of his actions. The henchman sees Richard in his dream when he doubts his path is going to lead him to a better life. We don't ever see Richard meet Beard, but Richard does mention in the intro to hard mode that they've met before. Judging by Beard's history, I'd say it isn't unlikely that Beard saw Richard when he first began to doubt his duties as a soldier. There are only two characters that never see Richard. One is Jake, and it's obvious why he never sees him. Jake is just a blindly loyal patriot. He never doubts himself. The other is Manny Pardo. Pardo never loses any faith in his cause. Even when his officers tell him that the Miami mutilators' murders aren't getting enough attention, Pardo just fires up and makes his murders more gruesome. The only significant change to Pardo occurs during his dream sequence. In it, his identity as the Miami mutilator is revealed, and even after he wakes up, Pardo feels his dream may come true. So he barricades himself in his apartment with a gun to his door. Despite fearing his secret is out, he still hasn't lost his conviction. Pardo still believes he can stop the police from apprehending him as long as he becomes really defensive. It's crazy and insane conviction, but it's still conviction. As long as you have conviction, you don't have doubt. That's why instead of seeing Richard, Pardo sees some creepy guy who claims to be his son. I think this creepy guy is supposed to be an embodiment of Pardo's crazy conviction to his cause. Now, since we've got the characters out of the way, let's make a closer comparison between the original game and the sequel. The first Hotline Miami had a really surreal atmosphere to it. Some people interpret that to mean that the world of Hotline Miami was a world in which basically anything could happen, but I disagree. I think the Hotline Miami world is actually a fairly realistic world, and the surreal elements of it are a result of the character's inner mentality rather than the external environment. Most of the first game happens in Jacket's head. He's in coma in the hospital, and all the events leading up to that point are rewinding in his head. But since it's in his head, surreal elements are added to the experience. After Jacket wakes up, he's back in the real world, so all the surreal elements basically just disappear. This is why there are no surreal elements in Biker Story. The reason why Hotline Miami 2 lacks the magnitude of surreal elements that the original game had is because most of the game isn't happening inside someone's head. Yes, we get small amounts of a level that involves a character's mentality, but most of the story occurs from a realistic perspective. Some people may not like how the series shifts from a dream-like state to a larger focus on the real world, but I think that's always been the ultimate goal of the series. All parables have a message, and I think the message of Hotline Miami is that ultimately games should grow out of the late 80s, early 90s mindless, violent style that seems to be only compatible in a dreamlike world and move into the realms of more thoughtful and skillful play that are compatible with the real world. That's basically how both games are structured. Jacket seems to join 50 Blessings because he wants to avenge Beard's death. 50 Blessings claims they want to topple the Russian government, but they don't seem to have any plan for doing that. They just hire people and get them to engage in violent killings of the Russian mafia. But the Russian mafia aren't endorsed by the Russian government, so how does killing them weaken the Russian government? The answer is that it doesn't. All 50 Blessings happen to be is an organization of bigoted patriots while looking for an easy way to commit hate crimes against Russians. Since the mafia are already criminals, it isn't difficult to kill them and escape repercussions. We see this in Jacket as well. He has no problem killing Russians, but when he kills the non-Russian guy on the street, he throws up. What's also telling is how Jacket feels after killing Biker. Biker wasn't a Russian, so after Jacket kills him, he does feel bad about it. That's why his dream starts to fill up with these dead bodies, and why the friendly store clerk gets replaced by someone who isn't very nice. You may wonder why Jacket killed Biker in the first place, but we already know the answer to that. It's because Jacket is just a reckless kid who doesn't think through his actions until it's too late. Even the level design makes a point about how pointless Jacket's mindless use of violence is. Examine how levels end in Hotline Miami. After you kill all the opponents, the game doesn't instantly go to the load screen. Instead, the game first requires Jacket to backtrack to his car. Why? Well, so Jacket and the player can have a good look at all the slaughter they committed. When Jacket comes in, everyone is alive, and when he leaves, everyone is gruesomely dead. Did all the slaughter really give the player the answers they were looking for? I don't think so. This level design concept is repeated in Hotline Miami too, but it's toned down there to reflect the difference in character values. Since levels are larger and less linear, characters don't have to see each and every person that they've killed before leaving the area. Since the game have more end-level cutscenes, sometimes characters don't even have to backtrack for the game to go to the load screen. The characters in Hotline Miami 2, for the most part, aren't mindlessly killing like Jacket. Yes, they are killing a lot, and the game does ask them to walk past some dead bodies, but overall, there's more thought behind their killings, so the game doesn't make as much of a big deal out of it as the first game did. The idea of senseless violence is also made by what Richard says to Jacket before he wakes up in the first game. He says that nothing more that Jacket will do will make a difference, and it's all his own fault. Richard is basically blaming Jacket for killing Biker. Remember, it's Biker who, through thoughtful play, is able to get to the bottom of things. It's Biker who figures out that it's 50 Blessings who has been manipulated all along. If Jacket had just spared him, all of this would have happened. However, Jacket didn't spare him. And what's worse is that Jacket can't figure out anything himself. When Jacket tries to find out who's making the calls, he's fooled into believing that it was the Russian mafia rather than 50 Blessings. And after Jacket finds that out, he just goes and does some more mindless killing. By slaughtering and slaughtering, Jacket does get trivial rewards like points, but he doesn't get the answers he's looking for, like the Biker did. The idea of thoughtful play over mindless murder is carried over to Hotline Miami 2 as well. 50 Blessings' continued mindless murder only results in a nuclear apocalypse by the end of the game. The characters, also while they're far from perfect, all seem to be more mindful than Jacket. Since they're each restricted mechanically much more than Jacket, they require the player to be more mindful while playing them. In fact, I believe that Jake's story drives this point further. As long as Jake can clear his last level, a bonus level can be unlocked for the player. You only get one shot at completing Jake's final level, so you have to be extra careful. By granting a bonus level to players who resort to careful play in the last level, Hotline Miami 2 is effectively emphasizing how it prefers careful play over mindless shooting by rewarding the player for using careful play over mindless shooting. It is also notable that the levels in Hotline Miami 2 are much larger, and a crazy run-and-gun style isn't as effective, as you can be shot from multiple angles. You can still execute this style to some extent, but overall you need to be more careful. So the game does encourage the player to be more careful and more observant of their surroundings before rushing in. Even the story itself of Hotline Miami 2 requires the player to be more observant and thoughtful. It's not just the stories arranged out of order in order for the player to piece together, it's also there's a lot of subtlety in the story. For example, Beard's story reveals to us that he wasn't really Jacket's friend, but rather his mentor or father figure. This is displayed by just one word that Beard uses to Jacket after saving him. He refers to Jacket as a kid. However, remember, in the original game, Beard never refers to Jacket as a kid. He refers to him as a man, talks to him as an equal. Of course, this isn't the real Beard, but just a projection of Beard in Jacket's head. So I think that Jacket saw Beard as a father figure, and he wanted to be raised by Beard into a mature adult. That's why we still see Jacket ringing up Beard for advice on life even after the war is over. However, Beard soon died in the real world, and in order to still be raised by him, Jacket created a projection of him in his dream world. This dream Beard was apparently there for Jacket all this time. He survived the nuclear holocaust, and by 1989, he no longer acts as the father figure, but rather as a friend towards Jacket, because by 1989, Jacket believes he has become a mature adult. Sheesh, Jacket really does sound like an immature child. Anyway, it's subtleties like these which can tell you a lot about the characters. That's why I like how the gameplay of Hotline Miami 2 requires players to be more careful and observant of what's happening on screen than the original game. Despite having a great soundtrack, Hotline Miami 2 is still a very visual game. Dialogue is still all text, so when the gameplay requires you to be more observant of your character and his surroundings, the gameplay also indirectly trains your eye to be more observant of the nuanced story elements, like subtle dialogue text. Despite being designed as a retro series, I think the reason why Hotline Miami resonates with a lot of people today is because a lot of questions it brings up are still being debated in the video game community today? Why do so many games require you to commit gruesome murders? Why does controversy sell? Are games art? The late 80s, early 90s period was a time when many of the enduring stereotypes of the video gaming world were established and continue to survive till today. Remember guys, these are all just my opinion. Anyway, thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please share it with others. Next narrative mechanics will be on Bloodborne. I'll see you guys next time. Have a great day.